Welcome to another episode where we look at history and culture through the lens of beer.
Always a good time.
We've talked before about how beer, it's woven its way through everything,
Yeah.
from ancient civilizations
Right.
to modern social movements.
Of course.
But this time, we're cracking open a particularly unexpected chapter.
Okay.
The surprising intersection of beer religion
Uh-huh.
and politics in 1950s America.
Now that's a combination I wouldn't have expected.
Right, you'd think after Prohibition was repealed in 1933,
Yeah.
everyone would just raise a glass and move on.
You'd think so.
But Pamela E. Pennick's research,
Okay.
the #1 social problem of our time,
Uh-huh.
American Protestants and temperance politics in the 1950s,
Okay.
tells a completely different story.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Even decades after Americans could legally enjoy a beer,
Right.
the temperance movement, fueled largely by Protestant churches, remained a powerful force.
I can't believe it.
Just imagine in the 1950s, a significant portion of the U.S. still lived in dry counties,
Wow.
where alcohol sales were completely prohibited.
Right.
And public support for Prohibition itself
Yeah.
was surprisingly high. This wasn't some fringe group. It was a movement with serious political influence,
Yeah.
shaping the cultural landscape of the decade.
So it wasn't just about bringing back Prohibition entirely.
Right.
What were these temperance advocates focused on in the post-war era?
It's a fascinating shift by the 1950s. The movement had moved away from trying to ban alcohol outright.
Okay.
Instead, they set their sights on something new, alcohol advertising. Picture this, the post-war era, a time of booming consumer culture televisions becoming commonplace in homes. And these anxieties about the influence of advertising, especially on young people,
Yeah.
the temperance movement was deeply concerned about the impact of those flashy beer commercials, particularly on youth.
Makes sense, right? They saw these ads and thought this is going to lead to a generation of juvenile delinquents.
Exactly. Their concerns mirrored broader societal fears about juvenile delinquency and the potential negative effects of mass media.
Right.
It wasn't just about the alcohol itself. It was
Right.
about pushing back against this wave of consumerism and media influence.
So who are the major players in this movement?
Okay.
Was it just a bunch of old-timey prohibitionists clinging to the past?
Actually, it was a surprisingly broad coalition of Protestant groups.
Really?
We're talking mainline denominations like Methodists and Baptists,
Uh-huh.
alongside more conservative evangelicals.
Wow.
Even figures like Norman Vincent Peale,
Okay.
the famous author and pastor known for his message of positive thinking, joined the cause.
Wow.
This shows just how widespread the concern about alcohol advertising was within the Protestant community.
Wow, that's a pretty diverse group.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about their motivations. So how did they go about trying to achieve their goals?
Well,
Did they just sit around and complain about beer commercials?
they were much more organized and active than that. These dries, as they were called,
Uh-huh.
were masters of grassroots activism. They launched massive petition drives, flooded congressional offices with letters, and packed hearing rooms.
Now that's dedication.
The sheer volume of their efforts was incredible.
I bet.
The New York Times even compared the turnout at a 1958 hearing to a Broadway hit.
That's amazing.
This demonstrates their dedication and effectiveness in mobilizing supporters and making their presence felt in the political arena.
Right.
This wasn't just griping, it was strategic and organized activism.
It's amazing to think about these people who deeply believed in their cause
Uh-huh.
and were willing to put in the work.
Yeah.
So they were clearly passionate, but did their concerns about alcohol advertising resonate with major Protestant publications of the time?
Well,
Did they actually have any influence on the media landscape?
they absolutely did. Pennick's article highlights how mainstream Protestant media really reflected this concern with alcohol even beyond dedicated temperance publications. She cites examples from the Christian Herald Christian Century and the Methodist Christian Advocate.
Wow, so they had a pretty big platform.
These weren't just small niche publications preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
These were major voices within the Protestant world.
So they weren't just trying to shut down the conversation entirely.
Right.
It sounds like there was room for different opinions even within the temperance movement itself.
Exactly. It wasn't just a black and white issue for everyone involved.
Right.
The Christian Herald, for example, while critical of the alcohol industry, also suggested alternative solutions beyond bringing back prohibition.
That's a more nuanced and interesting approach than I would expected. It makes you think about how complex this issue really was.
And speaking of complex, that's where things get even more interesting when we bring conservative evangelicals into the picture.
Okay, so how did they fit into all of this? Were they as gung-ho about the temperance movement as the mainline Protestants?
Well, it was more complicated than that. Historically, conservative evangelicals have been a bit more hesitant to engage in politics directly.
That makes sense. Politics can get messy, and they were likely more focused on individual salvation rather than social reform.
Exactly. There was this inherent tension between their core beliefs and calls for political action.
So how did they navigate this tension when it came to the issue of alcohol?
Pennock highlights the work of Carl F.H. Henry, a prominent evangelical thinker at the time. He argued that evangelicals shouldn't withdraw from the world completely, but should engage in a way that promotes their faith.
So get involved, but on their own terms.
Right. He felt there was a way to be involved without compromising their beliefs.
Sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It was, and it's reflected in how evangelical publications like Christianity Today and Christian Life approached the alcohol question.
So did they join the movement and demand a ban on beer commercials?
Not quite. They were a bit more cautious. They condemned alcohol consumption as morally wrong, but weren't always comfortable advocating for government intervention.
I see. So a moral stance, but not necessarily a legal one.
Exactly. They walked a fine line between their moral convictions and their reservations about political activism.
That must have been a tough position to maintain.
It was, for example, Christianity Today published an entire issue dedicated to the 25th anniversary of Prohibition's repeal. They talked about the problems caused by alcohol and actually encouraged the church to push for stronger government controls on the industry.
Wow, that's surprising. I wouldn't have expected that kind of stance from an evangelical publication.
It shows how complex and evolving their relationship with the temperance movement was. They were grappling with these larger questions about the role of the church in society and how to enact change within a secular framework.
It's amazing how this debate about something as seemingly simple as alcohol advertising connects to these larger theological and cultural shifts.
Yeah.
But what happened to the temperance movement as the 1950s came to an end? Did this crusade against alcohol advertising just keep going?
Like all social movements, it eventually lost momentum by the 1960s. The temperance movement had significantly declined.
Why the drop-off? Did everyone suddenly decide to embrace cocktail culture?
Not exactly. It was a combination of factors. Cultural norms were changing. Other pressing social issues came to the forefront, like the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, which captured public attention and energy.
Right, those were huge cultural shifts that redefined the American landscape.
And on top of that, you had the emergence of new vices like drugs and tobacco, which began to overshadow alcohol in the public consciousness.
So the temperance movement was kind of squeezed from all sides.
That's a good way to put it. This decline is particularly noticeable in how the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, a mainstay of the temperance movement since the late 19th century, tried to adapt.
What did they do to try and stay relevant?
They broadened their focus to include other substances, hoping to stay true to their core values while acknowledging the shifting social landscape. They also aligned themselves more closely with conservative evangelicals on issues like school prayer, finding common ground on issues that went beyond just alcohol.
So they were trying to find a new footing in a rapidly changing world. It's a reminder that even movements with deep roots have to evolve to stay alive. What can we learn from this often overlooked chapter of American history?
It reminds us that the relationship between religion, culture, and politics is constantly evolving, even in an era often associated with conformity and secularism. Like the 1950s moral values, particularly those rooted in religious beliefs, continued to shape public discourse and influence political debates.
It's fascinating how something as seemingly simple as alcohol advertising could become a battleground for such complex ideas.
It acts as a microcosm of the larger cultural struggles happening in post-war America, revealing the anxieties and tensions of a society grappling with rapid change and shifting values.
It also reminds us that history is full of surprises. Who would have thought that decades after Prohibition, temperance politics would still be stirring up such a fuss?
It just goes to show that you never know what you might discover when you delve into the past. Often the most unexpected stories are the ones that teach us the most.
And speaking of discovering more, don't forget to subscribe to the show for more fascinating journeys into the past.
Makes you think about how these things we think are kind of in the past are still kind of echoing with us.
Yeah. It's like we're seeing echoes of these debates, even now in discussion about advertising ethics and the influence of media.
Yeah.
It's clear that this wasn't just a quirky historical footnote. This was a movement that reflected deep anxieties about the changing American landscape and raised questions about individual responsibility, social influence, and the role of government that we're still grappling with today.
It also highlights, I think, the enduring power of grassroots movements
Yeah.
and the impact that even seemingly small groups can have when they're passionate and organized. The temperance movement of the 1950s may not have achieved all of its legislative goals,
Right.
but it certainly made its voice heard and forced a national conversation about important issues.
It's a reminder that history is made by real people, individuals who believe in something and are willing to fight for it. And sometimes those battles are fought over a beer commercial.
Who knew the history of beer could be so complex and revealing? It's proof that you can find fascinating stories and unexpected insights in the most unlikely of places.
Well, I think we've definitely uncovered a fascinating piece of history by exploring the temperance movement in the 1950s. It's a reminder that even in an era known for its embrace of cocktails and consumerism, a significant portion of America was still wrestling with the legacy of Prohibition and the role of alcohol in society.
Absolutely. And what I find particularly compelling is how this movement, while ultimately unsuccessful in its legislative aims, offers a glimpse into the anxieties and tensions of the post-war era. It reveals a society wrestling with changing values, the rise of mass media, and the role of faith in a rapidly modernizing world.
Right. It wasn't just about banning beer commercials. It was about trying to hold on to a certain set of values in the face of rapid social and cultural change. A reminder that sometimes most interesting stories aren't about the victories, but about the struggles and the questions they raise.
Exactly. And those questions about individual responsibility, social influence, and the role of faith in public life are still relevant today. Perhaps even more so in our hyper-connected world. It's fascinating to see how those debates play out in such a specific and, dare I say, refreshing way.
Well, there you have it, folks, another fascinating journey into the past, all thanks to beer. Be sure to subscribe to the show for more deep dives into history and culture. And until next time, cheers.